the military's culpability will come out loud and clear in the hearing.
Doesn't feel like we're about to start in 3 minutes, does it?
This hearing will come to order. Before my opening statement, without objection, I'd like to play a video, short video, from our friends at Radio Free Asia that highlights very much, I think, the scope and severity of the violence against the Rohingya. So if that's prepared, let's play that right now. While we're waiting for that, I see Mrs. Muhammad Ali in the audience, and I wanted to thank her for her focus on this issue and appreciate her presence with us here today. Thank you.
Since the 5th of September, there have been no armed clashes and there have been no clearance operations.
So one of the reasons that I thought we would show the video from Radio Free Asia is to make a point. There's very little information outside of these types of coverage that are coming out into the outside world, and more importantly, the Burmese people themselves. In Myanmar, there is no coverage of this information, so people do not actually know what is happening. The generals that run the country have a different narrative, and so there's very little recognition of the reality. In order to get to that reality, it is very important that we get reporters in on the ground, that we get USAID in to Myanmar, that we get the United Nations back in some way into Myanmar in order to cover, and because as long as that presence is there, it's a check to these types of atrocities. Now, there are few more pressing demands with respect to our attention to this immediate moment where we can do something to halt mass killings than the situation right now with respect to the plight of the Rohingya. As is often pointed out, for generation after generation now, they've been one of the most persecuted people in the world. And last week, for example, we heard testimony from two witnesses who had just returned from refugee camps in Bangladesh. And they told horrific stories, and to have them hear from a young mother torn from her burning home, separated from her husband and 3 daughters, finding out later, seeing that the husband had been brutally killed. You know, her story is just one of countless stories that we are now hearing about Rohingya refugees that are torn from their homes, that are forced to flee under these horrible conditions. For decades now, the Burmese government has systematically suppressed these people, called the Rohingya people. A 1982 citizenship law denies Rohingya Burmese citizenship, even though most have lived in that country for generation after generation. They've been denied freedom of movement. They do not have access there to education or to health care. They've been marginalized by every level that the Burmese government can marginalize them, from top to bottom. Formerly someone who was a minister, I talked with him, and he had had his citizenship stripped and could no longer run for office because he was deemed to be of Rohingya blood. This is the reality that these people face in terms of not being able to even speak up for themselves. Recently, we've seen the horrors of this decades-old persecution, and there is a fringe group, ARSA, a fringe militant group that has carried out attacks there and thus sparked a new round on top of the old pogroms that we saw over the last few years directed against the Rohingya. So now you have an estimated 507,000 Rohingya that have been driven from their homes. Most of that have been forced to cross over the border into Bangladesh. Hundreds have been killed. But as I say, you don't have journalists able to cover the story. They're denied access to the area, so I'm sure it's more than the reported number, much higher. 200 villages have been burned to the ground. Landmines have been placed inside Burma's border with Bangladesh, so that is maiming some seeking safe haven. It's little wonder that the UN's human rights chief called this a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Bangladesh deserves credit, and I talked again with the Bangladesh ambassador the other day. They deserve credit for opening their borders to this influx of refugees. The government, I know, will honor its promise in Bangladesh to build shelter for new arrivals and provide medical services. In response to this crisis, the Trump administration announced that it would provide $32 million in humanitarian assistance, and $28 million of that is going to Bangladesh right now, and the remainder is supposed to go into Rakhine State in Burma, and that's most welcomed. The state counselor, Aung San Suu Kyi, she's a Nobel Prize winner, but she must make it a top priority to provide for the safety of those in Burma, including the Rohingya. This is a dialogue I have had with her for a number of years on this subject, and the international community is pressing her as well. We know the military government's calling the shots, but we expect everybody who has access to a microphone inside Myanmar to tell people the reality of what's going on in the country. And that includes her. We know they're not hearing it from their media, but they have to hear it from other sources, and that's why I appreciate Radio Free Asia broadcasting this information in. Her recent statement questioning why the Rohingya were fleeing and denying that the military had conducted clearance operations, that is factually false. That's exactly what the military is doing there. As I made clear when I wrote her a month ago, her government and the military have a responsibility to protect all of the people of Burma, regardless of their ethnic background or religious beliefs. Those responsible for these atrocities must face justice. She and the military generals must rise to this challenge. This is ethnic cleansing. The protection of human rights has been our nation's top priority in Burma, including freeing Aung San Suu Kyi. And today, that must include also the Muslim Rohingya people. This is a moral issue, and it is a national security issue. No one is more secure when extremism and instability is growing in this part of the world. And I look forward to hearing from the administration on how it's using the tools that we have to end this humanitarian and human rights crisis. And I now turn to our ranking member for his statement. Mr. Engel.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and as always, thank you for calling this hearing, and let me thank all witnesses and welcome you all to the Foreign Affairs Committee. You're very welcome. The Rohingya crisis is raging more than 8,000 miles from Washington. At that distance, events like this can seem remote, so during my statement, I ask that we display some images that show the reality facing the people of Burma right now as a reminder of the human tragedy unfolding as we sit here today. These images are the result of the unprecedented level of violence in Burma's Rakhine state over the past 6 weeks. Violence that police and security forces have inflicted on civilians, inter-ethnic and inter-religious violence between Buddhist Rakhine and Muslim Rohingya. Because of this bloody conflict, more than 500,000 Rohingya, 60% of whom are children, have fled as refugees across the border into Bangladesh. More than 400,000 people left in the first 30 days, the swiftest exodus of any population since the 1994 Rwanda genocide and Serbia's 1999 ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Now nearly 3/4 of those who have fled don't have adequate shelter, and half have no safe drinking water. It's a heartbreaking humanitarian disaster, and it's getting worse. The Burmese military has claimed that this brutal crackdown is the response to a clash that took place on August 25th, in which border security forces faced off against Rohingya insurgents, reportedly using knives, small arms, and small explosives. But this isn't just some skirmish that's gotten out of hand. It isn't a legitimate counter-insurgency or counterterrorism operation. The Burmese military and border security forces have specifically targeted Rohingya using medieval tactics: slash and burn, rape, indiscriminate killing. 21 square kilometers of villages systematically burned to the ground. The UN's top human rights officials have called this a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. This flare-up is not an isolated event, but the latest chapter in a long history of discrimination against the Rohingya, a history in which they have been denied citizenship, the ability to work, freedom of movement. A few key Burmese leaders have figured prominently into recent events. As I see it, the only person in Burma who could put an end to this violence, clear the way for humanitarian aid, and allow for a full accounting of what occurred is Min Aung Hlaing, Commander-in-Chief of the Burmese military. Unfortunately, the intention of the military is clear: to remove the Rohingya people from Burma. Some of those watching this horror have laid part of the blame at the feet of Aung San Suu Kyi, the moral and civilian leader of Burma. There's speculation that she's either not getting accurate information or is severely constrained politically. Some assert that she's unsympathetic to the events in Rakhine, but I personally have a hard time believing that a Nobel laureate, a champion of democracy, and a person of her moral fortitude — she's come here, we've met with her — would turn a blind eye to the immense human suffering taking place in her country. I think American policy towards Burma has complicated the situation. The Burmese military drafted the Constitution, which allows the military to operate with impunity, maintain veto power in the Parliament, and legally retake control over the government. And yet, when the United States lifted economic sanctions against Burma, we also lifted sanctions against the military and the businesses that fund them. So while Aung San Suu Kyi has little leverage to rein in military forces that run amok, it's now legal for American companies to do business with Burmese military-owned companies. It seems to me at a time that the Burmese military is waging this sort of violence against innocent people, we should reconsider our policy on targeted sanctions. And in the meantime, we need to confront a serious humanitarian crisis that's going to persist for years to come. The United States has allocated $38 million to assist with the crisis. That number seems grossly inadequate considering the scale of the humanitarian nightmare now facing the government of Bangladesh. And this is in addition to the Rohingya still trapped inside Burma. Bangladesh, a country with an average income of around $1,300, is currently supporting nearly 1 million refugees. This is a country that already has close to the highest population density in the world. I want to recognize Bangladesh's ambassador, Mohammed Ziauddin, who is here today. Your government has shown tremendous generosity in welcoming these refugees. Thank you. And while your country opens its doors, I consider it an embarrassment that the United States is closing ours. The Trump administration has lowered our yearly cap on refugees from all over the world to 45,000 per year, the smallest number ever. As this crisis grows worse, and as it grew worse, Bangladesh took in that many people every 4 days. This policy harms American leadership on the global stage. It undermines our ability to speak credibly about refugees, human rights, or living up to basic international humanitarian principles. It diminishes our standing in the part of the world where China is only too happy to fill the void. So I do want to hear what our approach is, how the administration plans to deal with the crisis facing not just the Rohingya, but the Kachin, the Shan, and other ethnic groups under assault by the Burmese army, how this violence subverts the peace process and undermines the democratically elected government. So I look forward to your testimony. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. So we are joined by a distinguished panel here. We have Mr. Patrick Murphy, serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southeast Asia at the Department of State, and previously Mr. Murphy served as Special Representative for Burma, among other senior positions. We have the Ambassador Mark Strela with us. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department. Previously, he served in multiple senior positions, including serving as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Brussels and as U.S. Ambassador to Zambia. We have Ms. Kate Somvang-Surry. She serves as the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. She has served in a variety of senior positions at USAID, where she's focused on rule of law and on human rights issues. So without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions they have for the witnesses or any extraneous material for the record. So if you would, Mr. Murphy, I would ask you to summarize your remarks.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, I greatly appreciate the invitation to testify on the devastating human tragedy in Burma's Rakhine State and the suffering of ethnic Rohingya and other populations. I first want to thank this committee for its leadership on Burma and Congress in general for the bipartisan collaboration with successive administrations over many decades working on Burma. Over the past 6 weeks, militant attacks on security forces and on local residents, a disproportionate military response, vigilante violence, and a lack of civilian protection have aggravated long-standing challenges in Rakhine State. The current crisis has led to the desperate flight of over 500,000 refugees and displaced others internally. This massive and virtually unprecedented population movement has worsened the humanitarian situation in Bangladesh, where many Rohingya refugees already shelter. This administration is undertaking all efforts to end the suffering immediately. We have made clear to Burmese civilian and military officials they must take urgent actions and steps to stop the violence, respect the rule of law, pave a path for safe return, and hold accountable those responsible for abuses. In spite of assurances that security operations have ended, there are continuing reports of violence, including civilians participating in arson attacks and blocking humanitarian assistance. Those who have fled must be able to return to their homes voluntarily. State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi has stated that Burma will allow their return, and we are encouraging closer communication between Burma and Bangladesh. The two sides met this week and formed a joint committee to address repatriation. Most urgently, we must ensure that humanitarian aid reaches people in need. My colleagues will speak to this, but on the diplomatic front, we are working to overcome security challenges and local resistance in Rakhine State that have precluded many UN agencies and NGOs from reaching affected areas. We're also pressing for unfettered media access so that we can all learn in greater detail what is happening. President Trump has discussed the situation with leaders from Southeast Asia. Secretary of State Tillerson called on Aung San Suu Kyi to urge action. Vice President Pence denounced the military's disproportionate response. U.S. Ambassador Haley called at the Security Council for an international role. This crisis has implications far beyond Rakhine State. Burma's nascent democracy is at a turning point, and a heavy-handed response invites international terrorists and challenges for other neighbors. We are thus engaging with ASEAN to address humanitarian needs and actions to stop the violence. I was in Burma myself 2 weeks ago. Our ambassador and I met with top government and military officials, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Authorities committed to protect civilians, pursue accountability, and cooperate with the international community. The situation on the ground, nonetheless, remains grim. We must pursue all efforts to see full implementation of these commitments. I also visited Rakhine State. I met with members of the displaced Rohingya community. They condemned the violent attacks on security forces. I called on local officials and political figures in Rakhine State as leaders of ethnic Rakhine communities to end violence, facilitate assistance, and respect the rule of law. Under a government elected in 2015 by the people of Burma for the first time in half a century, there are efforts to address inherited, long-standing challenges of discrimination and neglect. One such effort was the establishment of the Annan Rakhine Advisory Commission, which produced valuable recommendations to address these challenges. The government committed to implementing those recommendations. The U.S. government is forming an overarching policy response to discourage abuses, ensure accountability, and further advance the democratization and development processes so desperately needed in Burma and especially in Rakhine State. We will not do this alone. We're consulting with the region, the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and courageous voices inside Burma to ensure human dignity for all. The current crisis in Rakhine has exposed the fragility of a transition we and Congress worked so hard to help achieve. The governing complexities underscore that no single actor can resolve this crisis. The national and local governments, security forces, community leaders, and indeed all peoples of Burma have responsibilities. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we're strongly engaged to bring an end to this suffering and to find lasting solutions in Rakhine State. We look to Congress as an essential partner in these efforts, and we thank you for the opportunity to describe what we are doing to address this tragic crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to this important hearing on the U.S. response to the violence against Rohingyas in Burma. I'm grateful for the opportunity to update you on how the U.S. government is targeting life-saving aid and on the challenges ahead. The violence in Rakhine State continues to devastate vulnerable populations within Burma and cause families, mostly women and children, to flee their homes for their lives. In terms of magnitude and speed, this is one of the most dramatic humanitarian emergencies to occur in decades. I'll briefly comment on the current humanitarian situation facing those affected by the crisis, discuss the challenges the international community faces in delivering humanitarian assistance, and comment on what the State Department is doing to address the situation. The attacks on August 25th and the continuing violence resulted in approximately 200,000 internally displaced inside Burma and prompted, as has been noted, more than 500,000 people to flee to Bangladesh, bringing the total number of Rohingya in Bangladesh to over 1 million people. The #1 humanitarian priority, as the chairman and the ranking member both have noted, is access in Burma, gaining access to those in need in Rakhine State. Burma's civilian government has committed publicly and privately to provide humanitarian assistance to all communities in affected areas through the Red Cross movement. The movement has stressed to the Burmese government that it will not be able to fully meet humanitarian needs and that UN agencies and international non-governmental organizations will also require operational space in northern Rakhine State. We take every opportunity to emphasize to Burmese officials at all levels of the government the need to allow humanitarian assistance to those in need. This week, PRM Acting Assistant Secretary Simon Henshaw met with Burmese officials at the UNHCR Executive Committee meetings in Geneva to express our profound concern. In all our contacts with Burmese officials, we continue to press the government and the military, both publicly and privately, to end the violence, to protect the security of all communities, and to allow Rohingya refugees to voluntarily return to their homes after Burmese authorities ensure they can do so safely. We are greatly appreciative of the government of Bangladesh for opening its borders to those fleeing the violence, many of whom arrived after walking for days and in need of food, water, and medical care. The monsoon season has exacerbated the situation, as flooding and poor infrastructure have made aid delivery even more challenging. In every meeting with Bangladeshi officials, we thank them for allowing refugees to cross into their country in such large numbers and urge them to uphold humanitarian principles while balancing their own security concerns. Earlier this week, I met with a high-level delegation from Bangladesh here in Washington for the U.S.-Bangladesh Security Dialogue, which included a discussion of the violence in Rakhine State and the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh. Our ambassador in Dhaka, Ambassador Bernakat, recently visited the refugee encampments at Cox's Bazar and has been in constant contact with Bangladeshi authorities on humanitarian issues. In addition to our diplomatic engagement, the U.S. is providing humanitarian assistance through our UN and other humanitarian partners to help vulnerable populations affected by the Rakhine State violence. The UN has estimated $434 million is needed for emergency response in Bangladesh through February 2018. In FY 2017, thanks to the support from this Congress, the United States contributed nearly $104 million in assistance to displaced populations in Burma and for refugees from Burma throughout the region. Of this funding, the State Department's contribution totaled nearly $76 million. This included the nearly $32 million in emergency assistance to which you have referred, which we announced in September, that allowed our partners to respond immediately as thousands were arriving daily in the already established and new settlements in Bangladesh. Our contributions provide life-saving assistance such as food, water, shelter, sanitation, health, and core relief items, and support to victims of gender-based violence. We are urging other donors to do more as well. I'd like to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by highlighting that in responding to this crisis, the State Department's primary concerns are protection and achieving meaningful, durable solutions for those who've been displaced, including the chance to go home in safety and dignity when conditions permit. The U.S. government humanitarian assistance provides an important lifeline until that possibility becomes a reality. In concluding, thank you to the Congress for all that you have done, and thank you for the way you authorize funds so that we are able to react quickly to these urgent requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kate Songwang Surry.
Yes. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak today and for your engagement on this important issue. The recent escalation in violence in northern Burma has resulted in massive displacement, as we've discussed, and increased humanitarian needs both in Burma and in neighboring Bangladesh. Burma has come a long way in its transition to a free and democratic society. These events, however, not only imperil the lives of thousands, but also cast a cloud over Burma's gains and threaten to undermine economic progress. Over 500,000 people, as we've discussed, mostly Rohingya, have fled the recent violence in Rakhine and have sought refuge in Bangladesh. For a sense of scale, that's nearly the entire population of Washington, D.C. leaving the city in just over a month's time. And in addition, there are tens and thousands of people who have been internally displaced and are in need of assistance within Rakhine State. USAID is providing humanitarian assistance in Burma, helping host communities in Bangladesh cope with the influx of refugees, and addressing tensions in ethnically mixed areas of Rakhine in Burma, including those not directly affected by the recent violence. As a Foreign Service officer who lived on the Thai-Burma border 16 years ago, working with migrants and refugees, Burma is for me, as it is for many, a special place and has influenced my path in international human rights and development. In my testimony, I will touch on USAID's response to the current crisis and highlight some of the challenges of providing assistance and bringing lasting resolution to this conflict. In Burma, our main humanitarian challenge is not a lack of resources, but a lack of access. Since the August 25th attacks, many of USAID's partners were forced to suspend their work due to military security operations in Rakhine State. Insecurity, government restrictions, and local communities' enmity towards UN, international NGOs, and local staff have prevented full humanitarian access, including along the border. False and misleading rumors about Rohingya, spread and fanned by official government information, have contributed to this volatility. We continue to call upon all parties to allow unfettered humanitarian access to people in need, and we urge the government to allow media and human rights monitors to access the afflicted areas. Reports of atrocities against civilians are extremely troubling and demonstrate the need for humanitarian assistance and protection from further violence, which are urgently needed. Together with our colleagues at State, along with the international community, USAID's mission in Burma has reiterated our concerns to the Burmese government and has called on them to end the violence, ensure that people have dignified, safe, and voluntary return to their homes. Additionally, USAID continues to support civil society within Rakhine State and across Burma to prevent the escalation of violent conflict and to counter hate speech and rumors. The speed and volume of people fleeing from Burma to Bangladesh has been staggering. We've seen, as we've discussed, over 500,000 flee in the span of over a month, a truly unprecedented rate, even faster than those fleeing Mosul, Iraq, or South Sudan over the past year. I don't use the term unprecedented lightly, but it is fitting in this scenario. Given the enormity of this influx, stark challenges remain to adequately respond. The people fleeing to Bangladesh arrive with just what they could carry. They're in immediate need of safe drinking water, of sanitation facilities, of emergency food assistance, shelter, healthcare, nutrition, and protection services. And poor conditions in these displacement sites increase the risk of disease and outbreaks. USAID's Office of Food for Peace has contributed $7 million to the World Food Program to provide life-saving food assistance. In addition, USAID is supporting essential coordination efforts needed to manage the massive influx and for the immediate scale-up in concert with our state partners. We also applaud the government of Bangladesh's generosity in responding to the severe humanitarian crisis, and we recognize that the communities are stretching their own scarce resources to take in their neighbors. We're committed to supporting them as well. In conclusion, the latest violence and continued conflict in Rakhine State has exacerbated the existing human rights and humanitarian crisis, impacting the lives of thousands. We must be honest and forthright in our assessment of the situation and clear on what we expect as humanitarians and as Americans. We shall remain resolute in our efforts to meet the needs of the Rohingya and affected communities in Burma and Bangladesh, and we call on all stakeholders to end the violence and seek a lasting resolution to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. This was always going to be a difficult transition for Burma to a more democratic state from the military control, especially given the tripwires of all the different ethnic groups inside Burma. But the most injurious decision, I think, that has been made by the military has been to restrict access of the United Nations to these areas like Rakhine State. Because what that does is that when you have a situation like the attack of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, this fringe group, they launch an attack. You had 10 police officers killed in that attack, and many of the attackers killed as well. That then gives the excuse for the local militia that is focused, that's trained and focused along ethnic lines to unleash their violence, and in this case, with the full support, apparently, of the military in Myanmar. And so you end up with a circumstance here without eyes or ears on the ground where there's no check to it. And had these arrangements originally allowed, in times of stress like this, the positioning, the continued positioning of UN personnel and Red Cross and NGOs up in Rakhine State, at least you would have observers on the ground that would have tampered. I mean, the information would have got out a lot sooner, and there'd be direct evidence of it, and it would filter across Burma. All of that is being locked out. And so, Mr. Murphy, you mentioned, Secretary, that you went up there and you had these conversations. But when you say to the military government, right now, can we bring the United Nations in here? Can we bring the Red Cross in here and start addressing these issues in these specific villages? What's the response? I understand that, you know, the response is, well, everybody's going to be allowed to come back to their villages. Where's the evidence that any of that is true? Where's the evidence that we've cleared the way with our interlocutors, with those who we've discussed this with, that are going to allow them to have access for UN and NGOs? Has it happened yet anywhere in Rakhine?
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with you that it's a significant mistake on the part of Burmese stakeholders to prohibit the UN agencies to have access to northern Rakhine State. Worse, I would point out that early in this crisis, military figures suggested somehow that UN agencies were aiding and abetting militant attackers. That was false. We called them out on that. That's since been corrected, but it created damage and increased tensions locally. We have told them that they can't do this alone. They need the help of agencies to scale up the kind of assistance that's needed. The UN agencies have experience in this part of the country, are on the ground and poised to operate. Aung San Suu Kyi did agree publicly to call for international help and assistance. We are urging that they take advantage of that by inviting the UN agencies
So to
back.
clarify this, although you had these discussions, the reality is that unless you personally lead these NGOs back in there and the UN back in there, I mean, they're willing to tell us that, yes, this is what they're going to do, but those are just words. You actually cannot get up there into Rakhine State to see these villages. We can't get NGOs up there, right?
Well,
Just to
Mr.
clarify
Chairman,
this point.
Mr. Chairman, there actually has been some small signs of progress in recent days. The Myanmar authorities are working with the Red Cross family of organizations, and just this week, Red Cross agencies have gained access to northern Rakhine State. There is some humanitarian assistance being delivered. It's not adequate. We are encouraging this to be scaled up with the kind of partners, World Food Program, the UN family of agencies that have the experience to meet all of the needs. It is a very difficult environment right now for a variety of reasons for these international organizations. I saw that firsthand. While I was in Sittwe, the capital of Rakhine State, there was a Red Cross shipment of supplies. Locals heard about this and came out and began attacking that Red Cross shipment. Now, local authorities, security authorities put down the attack, but this is the environment. There are local populations who perceive all of the assistance is going to the Rohingya and their own needs are not being met. That's inaccurate. That's a result of a lot of misinformation and a complicated, long-standing history of discrimination for all ethnic populations in the state. Therefore, we need to work with many stakeholders, not just the central government authorities and the security forces, but local leaders. And that's who I met with while I was in Rakhine. It's in their own interest to help facilitate the access of humanitarian assistance.
Let me just, because my time's going to run out, let me just, I've met with Kofi Annan in the past, and we all understand his advisory commission on Rakhine State that he chaired and the recommendations he made. But the ones that would seem particularly essential at this moment, besides the humanitarian assistance obviously being able to get to the people we want it directed at, is to ensure that the violators of human rights be held accountable. I think there has to be some understanding that there will be an attempt to trace down those who have committed these human rights atrocities. To strengthen bilateral ties between Myanmar and Bangladesh, very important at this moment. To train security forces deployed in Rakhine State. And I think this is an added point that we're going to have to address so that in the future there's some kind of effort in this training to ensure those verified as citizens enjoy the benefits, rights, and freedoms associated with citizenship there. And that's going to require us making that a component of this solution. To investigate and map existing restrictions on movement so that that is changed. And the government should roll out comprehensive birth registration, an ongoing campaign to make sure that girls and boys are registered at birth so that they recognize that they have full citizenship rights. And the government should roll out a comprehensive strategy to close all IDP camps in Rakhine. That, I would say, is essential. I'm going to go to Mr. Engel for his question. We have a 15-minute vote, and subcommittee chairman is voting right now and will take the chair while I vote. So, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two documents. The first is a report prepared by Amnesty International detailing their research and documentation of this crisis. The second is a bipartisan letter on the U.S. response to this crisis sent on September 28th to Secretary Tillerson and USAID Administrator Green from Senators McCain, Cardin, and 20 of our colleagues in the Senate. So I ask unanimous consent to have those two.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Murphy, let me start with you. There's ample evidence from satellite imagery and eyewitness accounts that Burmese military and security forces have been carrying out an intentional, systematic policy to drive Rohingya from their homes in Burma and to burn their villages to the ground. Medical professionals working in Bangladesh report hundreds of men, women, and children being treated for gunshot wounds because the Burmese military and security forces have opened fire on them as they flee. Senior United Nations officials have called this a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. The Commander-in-Chief of the Burmese military, Min Aung Hlaing, said there is no oppression or intimidation against the Muslim minority, and everything, he says, is within the framework of the law. He also said the Bengali problem was a long-standing one, which has become an unfinished job. So let me ask you, are the Burmese military and security forces responsible for violence and intimidation of the Rohingya in Burma, and do these actions constitute ethnic cleansing, in your opinion?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. The horrific actions that have taken place in northern Rakhine State are beyond troubling. This is a tragedy of epic proportions, and the security forces there in northern Rakhine State bear considerable responsibility for what we have called a disproportionate response. I think it's important to note that there are other contributors to violence in this area. There are the militant attacks that took place on the August 25th by individuals who claim responsibility for attacks that took place the year prior. There's also local vigilante action on the part of citizens and others. And these militants according to very credible reports, are exacting violence on some of their own population. This is a cauldron of complexities. What has taken place is absolutely horrific. My Secretary of State said that it's been characterized by many as ethnic cleansing. Ambassador Haley in New York said what has taken place appears to be a sustained campaign to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority. There are unknowns. There are populations that obviously have moved in great numbers. There are other populations that haven't moved. That's why we are asking for full access of media, humanitarian organizations, all steps to stop the violence. Let me also point out to Mr. Engel to another action. The United States earlier this year helped form a UN fact-finding mission. We are asking authorities in Burma to support and cooperate with that mission so that there can be full disclosure of what's transpired, not just in Rakhine State, but I hasten to point out there's conflict elsewhere in Burma, long-standing conflict, currently ongoing in the northeast in Shan and Kachin states, but Burma is a country that's been at war with itself since the 1940s, since independence. And the current government is struggling with these sorts of conflicts and refugees and displaced persons. We've talked about the displacement inside Rakhine State, potentially hundreds of thousands. There are hundreds of thousands of displaced individuals elsewhere in the country as well. You mentioned Min Aung Hlaing. Yes. As commander of the armed forces, he has enormous responsibility to stop the violence, to act in a proper manner with the security threats they believe they face. He's not the only stakeholder. We need actions from the government, from local Rakhine officials, and Burmese citizens as well.
So you would agree with me then that this is ethnic cleansing?
Mr. Engel, I'm pointing to our members of cabinet who have pointed to voices and evidence that would suggest that there may be ethnic cleansing. I would say what's more germane, what's more important is the actual humanitarian crisis, displaced persons, violence that hasn't stopped. That's our most pressing focus. There are mechanisms, there are bodies who are looking at what best to call this, but it is, at the end of the day, a human tragedy, and we want to do everything to stop it.
So will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Just for the record, myself and Mr. Engel, this committee, we identify this as full-fledged ethnic cleansing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What are we doing right now to hold the military accountable? Do you think that reimposition of targeted sanctions against senior military leadership or businesses that generate funds for the military is appropriate? And let me say, as a first step, I would encourage the administration to immediately stop issuing JADE Act waivers, which allow members of the Burmese military and their families to come to the United States, at least until such time as violence stops and humanitarian access is restored.
Congressman, thank you. We are exploring all options available to us to effect change inside this country with a focus on the armed forces. I think it's important to point out that we have in place already a substantial range of restrictions on the military. Our engagement is virtually non-existent. There is no training. Assistance is prohibited. That reflects the fact that the transition to democracy is not complete. Democracy has not been fully consolidated. We've talked about the expansive authorities that the security forces have over their own armed forces, 3 key ministries, one of the vice presidencies in the country. They are outside civilian control, particularly in this part of the country. We want to bring about accountability. There are ample evidence and reports of abuses and allegations. We will explore further tools. The JADE Act, which Congress put into place in 2008, remains very active. There are visa restrictions on all senior military leaders and their family members. The waivers that you refer to, Mr. Engel, are very sparingly and very rarely applied, only in the cases where it's in the U.S. interests. We are examining that very closely, not considering any expansion. For the time being, the JADE Act holds, and those restrictions remain in place.
I think that one of the issues is going to be, can we get the United Nations back more engaged again in Burma, and can the UN then be the conduit to get the Red Cross and to get NGO groups back into Rakhine State? What's the prospect at the United Nations that our ambassador could work with the Security Council to lay the foundation for a more robust presence? The very criteria that I just laid out that Kofi Annan helped develop in consultation while in Burma. He had been invited in and had worked with the counselor on Aung San Suu Kyi on this issue. So there is this possibility of the UN being the mediator or helping even in this role of setting up the dialogues between different ethnic groups up in Rakhine State if the international body can come in. Would that give us considerable leverage to get to some of these objectives?
Mr. Chairman, you rightly point out the critical, important role of the United Nations. And that is important in a variety of avenues of effort. The humanitarian assistance that you refer to, also the actions that potentially the Security Council could take, and let me point out the UN bodies that deal with human rights, like the Human Rights Council. I also want to offer that our ambassador in Burma, Ambassador Scott Marciel and his team, have been relentless on this and many lines of effort to address this crisis. They are working with the government to encourage an increased role for the United Nations. In fact, there is currently a UN presence in Burma on the ground, in Rakhine State itself. They are poised to activate their humanitarian operations. We've encouraged the government to invite senior UN figures to visit Burma, engage, discuss possible ways forward. And as the chairman pointed out, in New York, our ambassador and team are quite engaged at the Security Council in forging a way forward for the UN. I just want to emphasize there are many lines of action for the UN: humanitarian, accountability, human rights, and our press is on all of those fronts and encouraging cooperation inside Burma with these entities.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I'd like to add that our efforts at pushing for access have not been without any success whatsoever. Initially, the government in Burma had said that it would allow humanitarian assistance to pass only through its hands, and our ambassador in Burma and others insisted that that would not be possible for us. Eventually, they agreed to the Red Cross movement being a source of assistance directly in the region, and with the assistance provided through the Department of State, the Red Cross movement is staffing up from 20 in northern Rakhine State to, we hope, 200 soon to increase access. Access also has come in the way of, most recently, movement to permit one NGO from the United Kingdom to be present. And I would note that on October 2nd, our ambassador, Scott Marciel, was able to visit Rakhine State to see what was going on with his own hands and saw some of the destruction with his own eyes. So we will keep pushing, and I want to guarantee to you that we will support these agencies that are active, and we will keep supporting them diplomatically on every single front.
I appreciate your work in doing that. And again, I want to give a shout out to the ambassador of Bangladesh, Ambassador Ziauddin. Thank you and your country for what you have done and are continuing to do, and we look more to partner up with you. You know, too many times we see these disturbing things going on around the world, and this is the 21st century, and I know we've said over and over again, never again. Never again will we see these atrocities, whether it's in Nazi Germany, whether it's in Rwanda, any other place where we see genocide. And we, as humans, to tolerate this is intolerable, and we have to crack down and we have to find an effective way to bring partners to this. And one of my questions was, why do Russia and China feel that it is in their strategic interest to provide diplomatic cover for the Burmese military? Are they afraid of a democracy forming, another democracy forming? What are your thoughts on that? We'll start with you, Ms. Murphy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. Could not agree with you more that this is a human tragedy, and we don't want to see history repeat itself. Inside Burma, the plight of the Rohingya people is a long-standing challenge, decades and decades of repression and discrimination. The new government there is 18 months in the making and inherited this problem. needs to do more. We've called on the government to provide moral leadership. There are some efforts underway. As the chairman cited, the Annan Commission provides an important potential path forward. 88 recommendations. This was a commission formed by the government of Burma with expertise from outside and inside the country, and it deals with some of the most sensitive, politically challenged issues, including citizenship for the Rohingya, important development efforts, rights, and cooperation with neighbors, including Bangladesh.
Let me interrupt you there, because I just read a report, I think it was a day or two ago, where the Burma government said they would allow people to come back in, and I know there's proof of citizenship and all that. Have they worked through that, or are they at a point where they're like, you know what, we need to take these people back? And then another question, this will probably be for you, Ambassador Strela. If we can't rely on the Security Council at the UN, the obvious question that comes to me is, number one, is it efficient or effective? And the obvious question is no. So what do we need to do from the influence of the United States to say, you guys need to get your act together? These are wars, are crimes against humanity, and for us to continue to be involved with you, you need to tighten up your act, and let's get the results we want on the ground and stop these things. So if you guys could respond to that.
Congressman Yoho, on returns, a couple of things to offer. First, we have stated very clearly the right to safe, voluntary, dignified return must be an absolute. Aung San Suu Kyi herself stated that those who have fled will be allowed to return to their homes. A couple of things have taken place. We now need to see implementation. The Burmese earlier this week sent a senior minister, Chautent Sway, to Dhaka to begin discussions with Bangladesh counterparts. They together formed a joint working committee on repatriation modalities. That's important. We want to support that. Inside the country, the government has formed a committee to implement the recommendations of the Annan Commission recommendations in that report. This is good. Now we need to see action. And there are other stakeholders. This is not just a matter of the government, the civilian government, dictating refugees shall return. There are other stakeholders like the security forces, like local authorities in Rakhine State. There's no one single point of authority in the country, so it's very complex in that regard.
Well, and that leads to who's going to monitor it, who's going to police it outside of the Burmese government. Well, let me have Ambassador Strela and Ms. Samvang Surry. I'll ask you something if I have a moment. I guess I do. Go ahead.
Congressman Soho, thank you Yoho, thank you very much for that question. Indeed, we face obstacles in the actions that we want to take. I think that what is most important for us in dealing with the UN system and international organizations is that we look at all the tools that we have at our disposal and try to use all the tools as best as we can. It is noteworthy that the UN Human Rights Council, on which I once represented the United States, has extended the mandate for action in Burma. We should work with that. The 88 recommendations from the Annan Commission report have been accepted by the Burmese government and by the Bangladesh government. We should look at each one of those and determine which ones can be used best to press our case to provide for access and accountability. I think that we also have to continue to use our voice publicly, which our senior leadership has in New York and Washington, and also in Burma itself, and we should continue that. Finally, I think that we have to keep demonstrating to the Burmese leadership that it's in their interest to settle the issues inside their country so the country can get on with peaceful development and a better future for its own people. As you know, that's not so easy to do.
It's not. And we had a hearing on this last week, and it was disheartening because we brought up some of these issues. And Ms. Samvang Surry, since you were on the Thai-Burma border and you live there, what are the things that need to change? You know, when we had the hearing last week, it was recommendations that the UN needs to study this and do a report. In the meantime, we don't have time for that. We've got people dying on the ground, being run out, genocide happening today. We don't have time for a report. What do we need to change in the narrative or in the directive of the UN to intervene, go in there and monitor it, and bring in the appropriate world nations to help bring stability to this and stop this nonsense?
Thank you, sir, for that important question and for that point. The main thing from USAID's perspective that needs to change immediately is humanitarian access. Until and unless we're able to get into northern Rakhine State to provide life-saving support, as well as to be able to have media to come in to actually see and assess the situation, there's not much from a development assistance perspective that we can do until that happens. As the situation stands right now, as we've heard, the government of Burma and the military are in northern Rakhine, and the Red Cross movement has been granted permission. But aside from that, none of the UN agencies, none of aid partners are in there. We are in central Rakhine State and are able to restore some support there, but it's very limited, so we call for unfettered access. That's what
All
happened.
right, I thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to turn now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I say Mr. Chairman because you are the subcommittee chairman, and had a great hearing on this issue just a few days ago. So I'd like to congratulate you, and also to suggest that I think that Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel, they've done a good job in making sure that this issue is high on our priority, so the word is out around the world that we are paying attention. Perhaps more than anything else, that can have a positive impact. And this message is especially important for those people in the Muslim world who are being told that we are their enemy. And we have to let good people know all over the world, whatever their religion is, that we are on the side of ordinary people and their rights to live decent lives, and also without being murdered and raped, and the type of things that these poor people are suffering about, who are the subject of the hearing today. This does remind me, and I wasn't here for Elliott's remarks, but Elliott and I were very involved with the situation when a similar situation was in Kosovo, where you had Muslims who were being, obliterated. They were being ethnically cleansed. And at that time, it was by the Serbs. Let me just say that from what I see here, the Serbs at that time were acting very similarly to what we see happening in Burma. And I spent a lot of time working with people in Burma who were under attack 20, 30 years ago. So the Burmese, this vicious activity by the Burmese government shouldn't be looked at just as something aimed at this Muslim people. The fact is they are conducting themselves in an absolutely unacceptable criminal way with the Kachins, the Chins, the Karins, and the Karenni, who are Christians, the Shan, the central government in Burma and the Burmese army, which used to call themselves the administration before Aung San Suu Kyi was called the Schlork, which fit what was going on there. This has got to stop. And I don't think we should look at this just as the attack on these people, which is unacceptable, but we should look at it as an example of the behavior of the Burmese government and hold them accountable. We thought I was a big supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi. We are expecting more from her than what's happening. And perhaps the fact is, perhaps she's unable to do more. But we must mobilize public opinion. That's what this hearing's about, mobilize public opinion when such atrocities are being committed by the Burmese government. So, but let me ask, okay, so I've castigated the Burmese government, but I want to ask you about the our Bangladesh government now, because I have reports that significant amounts of money have been donated by oil-rich countries to Bangladesh to deal with these people, but that aid has somewhat disappeared. Is that correct?
Congressman Rohrabacher, if I first could thank you for your longstanding interest in Burma. We've had the opportunity to discuss many times over the years the challenges there, and these discussions are always quite fruitful. Before we talk about Bangladesh, I want to acknowledge the accuracy of what you've had to offer say about many suffering people throughout the country of Burma. And indeed, what I would add to the mix, inside complicated Rakhine State itself, on display is the terrible, terrible treatment of the Rohingya people. There are other minorities there as well who feel aggrieved, most notably the ethnic Rakhine, who happen to be Buddhist, but feel over many, many years they've been discriminated and repressed by central authorities and successive military governments. That complicates the environment to facilitate humanitarian assistance and give the Rohingya the attention they need. We have to think about the other ethnic minorities there too that are in need, are part of the problem, and need to be part of the solution. And indeed, we call on all Burmese people who have suffered through the struggle for independence, the 50 years of authoritarian rule, have suffered discrimination, repression, neglect, underdevelopment. We ask them to find in their own hearts compassion for fellow human beings who need basic dignity, apart from any political challenging questions, need respect, dignity, and safety. With regards to Bangladesh, I have been in communications with Bangladesh diplomats here in Washington. We're very, very grateful for the incredible safe haven that country has provided, not only in response to the current crisis, over 500,000 refugees, but substantial populations who have crossed following previous crises into Bangladesh. I'll defer to my colleagues to talk about the kind of assistance, but what we are focusing on is the much-needed communication between Burma and Bangladesh. We've seen some movement on that this week. We understand that the Bangladesh senior official plans some travel to Naypyidaw, the capital of Burma, for further discussions. This is good. The two countries have much in common, many challenges they need to overcome. Most importantly, the safe path to return of refugees to their original homes. Mm-hmm. And there was an earlier question about citizenship. Our understanding from the authorities in Burma is that citizenship is not a requirement for return. That's a separate process, verification and path to citizenship. There will need to be a process to identify where they came from, when they crossed. But those discussions are now underway, and we're going to focus on that very, very closely.
Let's note that many people in Congress, when we were dealing with a limited budget, some of us who do not believe in economy building or nation building as a target for foreign aid, we all believe that as human beings and and this planet, the American people do have responsibility toward their fellow human beings in cases of emergency and crisis. Now, this is not a natural crisis. This is a man-made crisis, and it is an emergency. So we are behind these efforts. But again, just one question is, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Mr. Ambassador, but I have been told that money that was donated by very wealthy oil-producing Muslim countries, that a lot of it has not gone to these folks who are suffering. I'd ask Our Lady from the USAID.
Thank you, sir, for that question. On the issue of support to Bangladesh, in addition to our U.S. support that we've been discussing today, I would note that a number of other countries have also stepped up their efforts. It's not just the U.S. That has seized with this issue. So the United Kingdom, for example, has pledged $33.5 million.
Is there any indication that that aid has been, that corruption is getting in the way of helping these people?
There's indication that some of the aid is going to much-needed life-saving support of the corruption issue, the issue you speak of specifically. I don't have knowledge of that right now, but we can look into that and get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We go now to Mr. Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony today. And I apologize if I retread any ground that we've covered already. I was at my other committee hearing. But as you know, this is an incredible time, a very tumultuous time for dispossessed peoples in the world. Europe is still facing its largest migration since World War II, mostly because of the Syrian conflict. But also in Southeast Asia, the Rohingya have been dispossessed. And so humanitarian organizations estimate that the cost to help them would be about $434 million. The United States, I know in September, I believe, committed about $32 million. My question is, as far as you know, what other nations are helping or groups are helping, and also, does the United States plan any further aid?
Congressman Castro, thank you very much for that question. And I'd like to start by saying that the magnitude of this crisis, as you have indicated, is so large that it's going to require many different hands to support the needs that are so evident and so urgent right now. The United States did indeed provide an additional $32 million on September 20th. On September 28th, USAID, through the Office of Food for Peace, announced an additional $6 million in assistance, and on that same day, PRM at the Department of State announced an additional, well, we didn't announce, we simply provided an additional $2.1 million. That's the end of FY17. We're going to review our funding in fiscal year 18, but we will fund against appeals themselves. The indication of $434 million in needs is a preliminary statement by the United Nations. We will be reacting to and examining actual appeals by different organizations to respond to them. But I do want to emphasize, as my colleague from USAID mentioned, we're not the only ones, and we should not be the only ones to respond to this tragedy. She mentioned that the United Kingdom has already stepped forward, but I would
add, how much have they put up?
33.5 million.
Any other European nations that have stepped forward?
Denmark provided $3.1 million, Australia $4 million, the European Union 3 million euros, Canada $2.1 million, South Korea $1.5 million, Japan $4 million, and Saudi Arabia $15 million. That's a beginning. The United Nations humanitarian coordinator, Mr. Lowcock, announced yesterday that there will be, in all likelihood, a pledging conference on October 23rd, and that may take place in Geneva, but actually we don't have the full details on that. I don't know that we will be ready to pledge additional assistance at that time, but we will certainly be ready to work with other governments to ensure that others come forward to help carry this burden.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
And yes.
If I could, Representative Castro, first I want to thank you for your leadership with the ASEAN caucus here in Congress. Very important entity in our relationship there at 40 years is very productive. But that gives me the opportunity to talk about the neighborhood. In my statement, I said that if this crisis is not managed and the violence brought to an end, it can have an impact on the neighborhood. Under military regimes, Burma exported refugees, illicit narcotics, trafficking victims. We don't want to revert to that, and we have been messaging with the neighborhood they need to focus on this crisis so it doesn't spread throughout the region. There's a growing potential for terrorism of an international flavor in Burma. That would spell bad news for the neighborhood. So we are working with ASEAN. ASEAN has activated its ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Program, and I believe it's only the second time, they call it AHA, only the second time they've activated this mechanism as a result of a non-natural disaster crisis. So they are providing assistance. We're also encouraging ASEAN to communicate, to encourage the stakeholders inside Burma to take the actions needed to end the violence, open up humanitarian assistance for international organization, and implement the Kofi Annan recommendations. We believe the voice, the collective voice of ASEAN could be influential in this situation.
And I probably have time for one more question, but has the United States been clear that this is ethnic cleansing? Has the State Department taken that position? Or how would y'all define it at this point?
Mr. Castro, I refer to my seniors in the U.S. government, Secretary of State, who said it has been characterized by many as ethnic cleansing. That must stop. Our ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Haley, stated that this is a brutal, sustained campaign that appears to be an effort to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority. There are separate processes underway examining the avenue of accountability. What we do know, regardless of discussions about what to call it, is that it's a human tragedy. 500,000 people on the move across the border, several hundred thousands displaced internally, and actions need to be taken now to stop the violence, deliver humanitarian assistance, as well as the efforts to hold accountable those who have perpetuated abuses and violations of international standards.
Will you permit me one more comment?
I will, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, thank you all for your efforts. Thank you for the initial assistance to this problem. And I hope that we won't lose sight of this, even though it's in a faraway place in the world for the United States. The pace at which news and devastating news hits us now causes whiplash almost for not only Americans, but also for those of us in Congress as we deal with human tragedies. So, you know, we'll keep working with you on this.
Would the gentleman yield, Mr. Castro?
Sure.
The other thing I thought I'd clarify is the $32 million is the latest tranche for this fiscal year. The total is $104 million for Burma, the vast majority of that for the Rohingya situation. But in additional funding, we have for regional humanitarian assistance some money that we don't break out by country. So it would be in excess of the $104 million so far. But it's a good point that we will stay on top of this, and I just
thank you, Chairman.
Mention that for the record. We go now to Ann Wagner, Ambassador Wagner, Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief here. I've got to run to another financial services hearing here, but I want to first acknowledge the Bangladesh Embassy for the work that they're doing to give refuge to the Rohingya. I thank them very, very much. I'm devastated by the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Burma. For over 60 years, the Burmese government has persecuted religious and ethnic minorities, from Christians to in Kachin to Muslims in Rakhine State. We are in part to blame for not holding the Burmese government and military accountable for their actions, which we knew about full well as we lifted the sanctions. Ambassador Strela, you indicated in your written statement that you are supporting the elected government's efforts, including the Rakhine Advisory Commission. I understand the political expediency of supporting the commission, but Burma has clearly abdicated its responsibility to protect. And the U.S. should officially recognize mass atrocity crimes against Rohingya Muslims and unequivocally support an independent investigation. Downplaying human rights violations and impunity has not resulted in national reconciliation. It has perpetuated more conflict and a lack of accountability. Ambassador Strela and Assistant Secretary Murphy, when will the United States push for an independent investigation into these mass atrocity crimes?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, and agree with your characterization of this longstanding challenge that is abhorrent and now on full display. But for those of us who follow the country for a long time, we've seen big population movements in the past, 1970s, 1990s, crisis again in 2012, last year as well. Irregular migration in 2015 caused a crisis for the entire region.
Independent investigations, please get to the point.
We are supporting, Congresswomen, as a co-sponsor at the Human Rights Council, a UN fact-finding mission that was recently extended, the mandate for this program to look closely at the abuses, gather information, and make determinations on the way forward. I hasten to point out there are not just challenges in Rakhine State. There's ongoing active conflict elsewhere in the country.
Correct.
In particular, in Kachin and Shan states. Those conflicts need to come to an end. There are many actors inside the country, I also want to point out, in terms of pressure points. There's the civilian government. There are the security forces. There are local ethnic leaders. There's the broad population.
Why is not, and I'm reclaiming my time, and I've got a short amount here. Why isn't the U.S. doing its own independent investigation? Why are we not doing that?
We have many efforts underway, first and foremost, to bring this immediate crisis and suffering to an end. We are indeed looking at tracks for accountability. As we stated earlier, we are attempting to gain access to northern Rakhine State.
With apologies, we've been looking at this while people have been suffering for 60 years. Ambassador Strela, some countries are hesitant to officially call survivors in Bangladesh refugees. How do we address the needs of Rohingya who have no home to return to. How would you classify these stateless people who were forced to leave their country, running from likely genocide?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for that question. And I would like to say that right now there are 1 million Rohingya residing inside Bangladesh. We have all recognized the incredible generosity of the government of Bangladesh and its people. It's perhaps more than there are Rohingya left in Burma at this time. We consider these people refugees. We think that they should come under the mandate of the UNHCR and the international legal instruments that apply to that. The United States has been very gratified to see that the Bangladesh government has undertaken a registration process for the people who have crossed the border. This is something that at times has been controversial in the past. They're doing so now with the assistance of UNHCR. This will give us a record of who has come across the border, which will help us provide greater protection under international law for them. It's a slow process right now. I think that they're able to register right now, as they've just started the process, about 6,000 per day. This is going to help. And I think that it's important to recognize that the government of Bangladesh has increased its cooperation with UNHCR under these circumstances.
Thank you, thank you. With the chair's indulgence, I have one last question.
The gentlelady's time has expired. We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
I will submit it for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on, I think, where my colleague, Ms. Wagner, was leading, Mr. Murphy, I guess I don't understand your reluctance to call this what it is, ethnic cleansing. I mean, you've used code, disproportionate response by the military, other sources of violence, a culture of complexities. At least Nikki Haley admitted it appears to be ethnic cleansing. When 800,000 people of a particular ethnic background are living in the neighboring country because they've been forcibly removed from their villages, I'd call that ethnic cleansing, and pretty clear and simple. What is your reluctance to call it what it is?
Thank you very much, Congressman Connolly. I appreciate your perspectives and concern about the situation, as we are deeply, deeply concerned by the human tragedy, and that's what it is.
Let's stipulate we both are concerned. We accept that. Why not call it ethnic cleansing? What is the nature of your reluctance as a diplomat representing the State Department to call it ethnic cleansing? Are you afraid you offend the Burmese military, or, I mean, what is our concern?
No, there's no reluctance, Mr. Connolly, at all. I have referred to our senior officials, including Ambassador Haley and Secretary Tillerson, who have referred to what appears to many to be ethnic cleansing. The important thing now is action to end the violence.
I get that, Mr. Murphy, but I'm an English lit major. Words mean something. And you are still evidencing a reluctance to call it ethnic cleansing. My question to you is why?
In part, the situation must be focused on the UN fact-finding mission. That is a deliberative process to look exactly at what's taken place there and elsewhere.
I'm sorry,
we're supportive.
I'm worried
of that
about time.
process.
I'm not trying to be rude, but I only have 3 more minutes, and you see the chairman's strict. So we're waiting for the UN.
No. That is a parallel process that we are strongly supporting.
So we don't care whether the UN finds it ethnic cleansing or not. We're free to call it what we think it is.
Absolutely.
Well,
a human tragedy.
Then why don't you call it ethnic cleansing?
It's a human tragedy.
Mr. Murphy, do I look like a fool to you?
Would the gentleman yield
Yes,
for a
sir.
moment?
Of course.
Just to quote Ambassador Nikki Haley, who I have talked to at length on this issue and is speaking for the administration, I presume, on this issue. She says it is a brutal, sustained campaign to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority, to cleanse the country of an ethnic minority. The UN is engaged in its assessment of the situation, but I would say that that puts us out on the ledge of what I and Elliot Engel and us on the committee have named and called ethnic cleansing. We encourage everyone to use that term, but I just wanted to clarify Nikki Haley's.
Yeah, I thank the chair, and apparently that word hasn't gotten to the Deputy Assistant Secretary.
He had used the quote earlier.
I just, sometimes we have to be careful, but when we're looking at the kind of tragedy we're looking at here, it seems to me speaking with clarity actually is an important tool of diplomacy, not fuzzifying it with other kinds of descriptions that clearly, deliberately are avoiding calling it what it is. By the way, I'd ask the chair if he might just restore a little of my time.
But of course.
I thank the chair. Okay, let's see. Mr. Murphy, when Mr. Engel asked you about sanctions, you said we're exploring all available options and many restrictions remain in place, especially with respect to the armed forces. Could you elaborate? Does that means no military-to-military training, for example, or that military assistance directly is still on ice?
Yes, sir. What that means is there is a prohibition on assistance to the Burmese military. There is a broad set of visa restrictions that apply to senior military leaders and their families that remains active. There is a very, very limited ability to engage with the Burmese military on issues like humanitarian assistance, human rights, international standards, but that has been so nascent and almost negligible. But primarily, this is not a normalized military-to-military relationship by any stretch, and has not been for decades.
Yes, I agree with that. The military was driven to open itself to the outside world back in 2011 and came to some kind of uneasy peace with civilian government up to a point, allowing elections and Aung San Suu Kyi being the effective leader of the country. Not by title, but she's got it. What has liberated the military in this situation to feel that all of those restraints or all of those boundaries do not pertain and we're free to engage in this ethnic cleansing with such violence and effectiveness, actually?
Congressman, the transition that you referred to enjoyed the support of many in the international community, providing Burma perhaps with its first and best opportunity to address so many longstanding challenges. The transition to an elected government allowed the will of the people to be expressed. However, the armed forces designed and implemented the very constitution that forms the basis for government. That places a lot of limitations on this new government. The military accords full authority for its own security forces.
Mr. Murphy, I was in Burma a year ago. I met with the head of the military as well as Aung San Suu Kyi, and I absolutely take your point. But my question really, though, is in this time period until this, they've shown a certain restraint, a certain caution. There are also restraints on the civilian side. They know there are unwritten boundaries. But in this case, all of that seems to have been pushed away, and there seems to be no sense of restraint by the military with respect to the Rohingya. Why do you think that is? It's out of character with what I think would characterize the last 5 or 6 years of their behavior.
Congressman, I would say not entirely out of character because there is ongoing conflict in northern Burma. At any point in time over the last 70 years, there has been active conflict somewhere between the Tatmadaw and the
Mr. Murphy, my time is up. But look, all of that's true. But they haven't pushed 500,000 people into another country in such a limited time frame, and I'm asking you your assessment. Why do you think at this moment they kind of changed their behavior and really accelerated this in such enormous numbers and with such impunity?
Congressman, without explaining any understanding or condoning the actions, I can point to what the security forces say, what the narrative in the country is. They feel that they are under attack. The militant coordinated assaults on August 25th
by the Rohingya.
By Rohingya militants, a new organization that now claims responsibility for attacks as well in 2016. This has bumped up a level. They were coordinated. They resulted in deaths. This feeds a narrative popular in the country that the sovereignty of the country is under assault and they face a serious terrorism problem. They obviously have responded in a very disproportionate manner and have failed to protect civilian populations. Regardless of that threat, they have behaved in a way that has exacerbated the problem and the challenges.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. We go now to Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony here today. It strikes me that for the last probably 20 years, I've heard folks of a broad array of political strikes extol the virtues of Aung San Suu Kyi, the progress in Burma, etc., and that tool that is at our disposal that I think is infrequently used, but oftentimes effective, is that of shame. I wonder if any of you could elaborate on the potential to bring pressure on the government of Burma to amend its behaviors by virtue of publicizing the realities on the ground as it relates to the Rohingya, and essentially motivating I don't know what the proper Aung San Suu Kyi, I don't know whether it be Ms. Suu Kyi, to compel different behavior by virtue of that tried and true traditional tactic of shame. In other words, do you think it might help to shine light on the reality? What role could the United States take to that end, both in the global media world and in the United Nations, and as an influencer of ASEAN and as a member of CIATO, et cetera? And it's wide open. Mr. Murphy, you can take a break if you want. You're also welcome to answer, but if you'd like to catch your breath, you can.
Congressman, thank you very much for that question. I can answer from the humanitarian assistance perspective, and will not try to cover the entire scope of your question. But I do want to say that it's extremely important to document what's going on, and it's extremely important to bear witness to what's going on. The government of Bangladesh has accepted over 500,000 people onto its territory. Our ambassador in Dhaka, Masha Bernakat, I spoke with her last night, and she immediately went to Cox's Bazar to check on the circumstances there, and there she brought the press with her. And she interviewed people, including women who had been subject to gender-based violence, to hear their stories, and she has related them. That is not, that is part of our humanitarian approach, but it also shines a light on what has happened, and it's very important for us to continue doing that. Thank you.
Oh, you can talk. I wasn't telling you not to talk. I just felt like you'd kind of been right to cross the coals there, and candidly, to be fair, I know you don't single-handedly shape U.S. policy, but I am a little bit sympathetic to, mark this down, it's a red letter day, to Mr. Connolly's line of questioning. But yeah, go ahead and speak to it, please, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, and I appreciate the perspective. What can we do? This is a source of frustration, and we're outraged by the human suffering. There are many stakeholders inside the country that need to take action. This is not a monolithic authority. There's the government, there are the security forces, there are local ethnic leaders inside Rakhine State, there's the broad population. All of them need to take actions. I would agree.
Let me interrupt you for a second. And again, I'm not trying to double down on beating up on you. It's been my experience, whether it's in Burma or it's in Central America or whether it's in Africa, that the local militias, et cetera, operate with a great deal more impunity when the government's willing to look the other way. Obviously, they continue to exist even in contrivance to the government in many instances, but I think right now what we're seeing, what I understand is that they operate with impunity because the government either condones it or doesn't do anything to deter it. So, sorry, go ahead.
I agree with your perspective, and I appreciate that. I think the fact that we herald the transition to a more democratic Burma does not absolve the government of criticism. And indeed, as Ambassador Haley said in New York, we should shame Burma's leadership. We're looking for more. At the same time, there are figures who are attempting to do what has been unattempted, unprecedented for many, many decades. That is to give Rakhine and the Rohingya attention, a path to citizenship, right now, a path to return to their homes. We can't affect action from outside the country without action by stakeholders inside the country.
Let me interrupt you because I got 10 seconds, because you touched on something that is a path to return to their country. It's so frustrating. I know I'm over. I'm going to wrap up quickly. Because I spent the better part of a year in a uniform in the Balkans, and we watched 6 million internally and externally at least displaced people from Iraq and Syria. And we see it here with Burmese Rohingya pushed into Bangladesh. And we always talk about creating circumstances where people can return to their homes, and they never get, I mean, with small exceptions, they never do. So it's not directed at you. It's more of a frustration of the world that we live in, and perhaps an implorement to find a better paradigm moving forward. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your questioning, Mr. Garrett. We now go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony this morning. I'd like to focus very specifically on the sanctions and what specific actions the administration is considering in terms of removing or revising any of the existing waivers on sanctions on Burma. I know earlier in testimony it was suggested that waivers are infrequently used. I just pulled up on my phone a long list of sanctions that were waived with respect to Burma. So I want to know very specifically, is the administration looking at revoking or advising those and, you know, instituting additional sanctions? What's the downside of that, and particularly sanctions with, you know, the military in Burma that is responsible for this outrageous and atrocious behavior?
Thank you, Congressman. I think what you are getting at is what consideration of actions can we take that can affect behavior change inside the country of actors who need to stop the violence. We have a deliberative process, interagency process underway where we are looking at all options.
Including the waivers? Including removing the waivers that have been previously granted?
All the available options are under consideration. Reimposing restrictions, expanding restrictions, or is there a different variety of assistance and cooperation that in fact is needed? What we are motivated by are two things I would like to highlight. One, there does need to be accountability for any abuses and violations. That's a very important track. That will be ongoing. In the very immediate term, we need to take actions that help the plight of people who are vulnerable, at risk, facing violence. We don't want to take actions that exacerbate their suffering. There is that risk in this complicated environment. That doesn't withhold us from action, but it means we want to be very deliberative and careful about what we do, Congressman.
I understand that. In fact, that leads to my very next question. What are we doing to ensure, and this is really for the administrator, that women and girls who have been subjected to unspeakable sexual violence are receiving the care, and not only medical care, but the comprehensive counseling on and all the things that a victim of this kind of violence absolutely requires? And are we taking any steps, either alone or with our partners, to help mitigate the risk of sexual violence?
Thank you, sir, for raising that very important issue. As you highlighted, within a vulnerable population already within the Rohingya, women and adolescent girls are especially vulnerable. We've talked about the limitations on movements within the community. Women and girls have further limitations, not only just staying in the camps, but as Muslim women and girls, in some cases having to stay in their homes and shelters, which really makes them much more vulnerable and susceptible to things like trafficking. As you know, we do not have access to northern Rakhine State to see the situation firsthand, but we have heard reports, as those who've crossed over to Bangladesh, of exactly the sorts of gender-based violence you've mentioned.
But my question is, I'm aware of I think we all know the problem. I'm asking, are we doing anything about it?
So what we're doing on the humanitarian side is helping to provide things like psychosocial counseling, which is very important, getting access to health care, clinical rape kits, trying to provide child-friendly and other safe spaces. But until, as I mentioned earlier, until we're actually able to, that we can do on the Bangladesh side, and Ambassador Strela may want to elaborate on that, but within northern Rakhine State itself, since we do not have access, we are unable to provide the kind of protection services that are essentially needed, so we continue to call on the need for that.
Next, I'd like to ask whether or not, you hear the numbers in terms of the refugees who have gone into Bangladesh, nearly 750,000, I think. And we have to wonder, have we lost our leverage as a country to be effective in this conversation when we only are accepting 45,000 refugees? And what impact is that having on what we're asking of other countries and what they're undertaking? It seems like it would have significantly reduced our leadership and our credibility on the issue of refugees when at the time of a crisis like this, where we've actually reduced to an embarrassingly small amount the number of people who are accepting into our own country. I don't know, anyone is free to answer that.
Congressman Cicilline, the United States record on accepting refugees is quite an admirable one. Since 1975, the United States has resettled over 3.3 million refugees in the United States, giving them full rights to citizenship, work, education, and the rest here. The President each year, as you know, sets a ceiling for the fiscal year coming up on the number of refugees who will be admitted. This year it was set at 45,000. The number has varied over time, but it's important to recognize that it's a ceiling. And that means that over the years, we have never actually surpassed the ceiling. We've come very, very close several times, but sometimes we've missed by 10,000, even 20,000.
Ambassador, that's really not my question. With all due respect, I know our history, our very proud history of refugees, and it makes me very sad that that history is changing with this level. My question is that decrease diminishing our leverage in this conflict or in this crisis? Not, I appreciate the history. It's exactly what's not happening now, and I'm asking, is that undermining our ability to be a leader in this crisis?
Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to have to cut you off. If you could submit that answer for Mr. Cicilline, I'd greatly appreciate it. David, if you don't mind.
No, I don't have,
Ms.
Mr.
Perry,
Chairman.
thank you.
I just ask unanimous consent that these 3 pages of waivers granted for the military or for Burma be entered into the record, and I look forward to a written response as to what the administration is going to do with respect to specific reviews.
I think those are very important, and without objection, we'll submit those. Thank you.
Mr.
Perry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me join the long list of those who give accolades and acknowledgement to the Ambassador of Bangladesh and our gratitude for your help and assistance in this crisis. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you. I'm frustrated again this week as I was last week. Let's get right to the point. Do we understand, do we acknowledge and agree that time is of the essence? There's an urgency associated with this circumstance. Right? Last week, we're talking about 1 million Rohingya, right? And as of last week, in about a time span of 30 days, as of last week, 488,000, from my notes, were either displaced or murdered, right? So if you're looking at the sheer numbers, we got about 30 days to deal with this. Now, we're all talking, we're sitting here in our white shirts and our suits, and these people are being slaughtered and thrown out of their country. I'm frustrated. Burma is a sovereign nation, as the United States is a sovereign nation. Somebody needs to take action, and I don't think anybody here is discussing or is implying that we should go invade Burma. I don't think anybody's implying that, and I'm certainly not implying that. But while we talk about sanctions and when we talk about foreign assistance, these things take a long time. We got 30 days or less. So my question to you, first of all, Mr. Murphy, I appreciate, and Ambassador, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to attempt it. What can be done right now? Or can sanctions have an effect right now? Can foreign assistance have an effect right now? What can have an effect right now? Right now. People are dying today as we sit here.
Congressman, I think we share your frustration and concern.
I know you do.
Absolutely. And
the UN.
And I will restate
anything
that we are fully seized with taking all measures to end human suffering now. We are working with the United Nations, UN Security Council, UN Human Rights Council, with ASEAN, with all of the stakeholders in Burma. I traveled there 2 weeks ago. Our ambassador and his team are relentlessly pursuing all efforts. We have achieved some results. There is humanitarian assistance being delivered in Rakhine State. It's insufficient, but we have opened an aperture and we're seeking to widen it to reach all people in need. We are looking for actors to take steps to stop the violence, including vigilante action undertaken by local civilians. There are responsibilities for the government, for the armed forces, for local ethnic leaders. We are communicating with all of them. We are consulting with our partners around the world. We are on this in every way possible.
I don't doubt you. I don't doubt you for an instant, and I sense that you sense the urgency as well. But with all due respect, it just doesn't seem to me that any of the things that you're talking about are going to be effectual. We're going to get at the end of this next 30 days, and maybe we're going to have another hearing in this nice room, and we're going to talk about all the things that happened, and we're going to do an investigation, and we're going to get after those who are responsible, and it's all going to be history. I'm looking for some methodology, some vehicle today, right now while we sit here, where you walk out of this room and go say, we're going to go do this, and it's going to stop this from happening. Is there any potential for anything like that? Whether it's the U.S., whether it's our partners in the region, whether it's the United Nations, because I feel like we're talking. That's great. We're making sure that we don't make the matter worse, which is admirable and appropriate. But I got to tell you, I got to walk out of here and vote in a couple minutes. I have no confidence that the Rohingya aren't going to continue to be slaughtered until we come back in this next room, and there's none. They're all in this man's country, and none of them are in Burma. Is there any reason for me to believe otherwise as I walk out of here to go vote?
I wish, Congressman, there was a simple solution. We really do. What we have to keep focused on are the efforts underway. This doesn't get resolved without stakeholders inside the country taking action. The fact that there is humanitarian assistance, there is an agreement to implement the Kofi Annan recommendations, there are discussions with Bangladesh on repatriation of refugees. We have to support these efforts. We have to hold those accountable, and there are efforts underway to identify those who are responsible for violations and human rights abuses.
If these folks don't let us in their country now to do an investigation, what makes us think that they're going to allow an investigation post facto while we can take them to The Hague for war crimes? Why would they do that?
I don't take the reluctance of any of these stakeholders in the country as a reason to stop our efforts.
I understand. I agree.
We are absolutely relentless on this, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. My time's expired.
I appreciate your passion and your concern there, Mr. Perry. Ambassador, do you want to say something else? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, and it doesn't really answer Congressman Perry's question altogether, but I do want to assure you, Congressman, that the generosity of this Congress has made it possible for the United States to provide life-saving assistance now to hundreds of thousands, well, 100,000, I'll say for sure, who have been fed thanks to the generosity of this Congress.
I appreciate you saying that. You know, and this is just something we've seen over and over again, as you saw the frustration here. I'm like Mr. Perry. I want action now. We don't need a study. We need action. And when you have a military government mixed with a civilian government, but the military has more clout and has veto power, I don't see things changing because there's nobody holding the military people accountable. And that's where the UN needs to be more effective. The world community needs to be more effective. And how effective would it be if we were to suspend foreign aid until Burma allowed the UN inspectors into Rakhine State? Real quickly, and I'm going to close out.
Thank you for raising that. I think with the gravity of the situation, we obviously need to look at all the possible tools of leverage on the table. I would note, though, our foreign assistance right now, none of our foreign assistance is going directly to the government of Burma. It's mostly in terms of helping support the people of Burma.
It looked under 5%.
Yeah, so it's more in terms of supporting the people of Burma, civil society organizations, the democratic institutions that are necessary for the transition and the peace process. We would strongly encourage that we take a look at that issue as we consider it.
I want to thank you all for being here, the audience for being here, being respectful and weighing in on this very important this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses, members, for taking the time to be here. This is a human rights issue and a national security issue. We will remain attentive to this pressing matter, and as it gets imperative that we will hold all perpetrators of this violence, including the Burmese government and military, accountable. The committee stands adjourned.